Okay. Awesome. Okay, cool. So thanks for joining, and we're gonna launch right into it. And if folks have questions, use the chat, and then we'll also kind of make some time at the end, as always, for questions as well and discussion. So we're kind of talking about what we should talk about. And we're going to give a lot of time to public input today, because we had a lot of activity and a lot of really awesome engagement from commissionship supporters. But there was one agenda item in the meeting that we wanted to sort of pull and unpack a bit. And that has to do with the Middle Pecos Groundwater Conservation District and a lawsuit that they filed against the Railroad Commission. And what that actually means and what happened today. So I'm going to turn it over to our executive director, Virginia Palacios, to kind of give us the scoop on that agenda item.
Okay, let's get into it. Before we go, let's introduce everyone because the viewers might not know. So I'm Virginia Palacios. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the executive director of Commissionship. This is SJ Stout, our senior communications manager based in Houston, Texas. And Marta Valadez, our organizing director based in El Paso. So thanks for joining us today, y'all.
Yeah.
So without further ado, I'll get into the Middle Pecos Groundwater Conservation District issue. So MPGCD, as their acronym is, they filed a formal complaint with the Railroad Commission about a year ago, I think a year and a half ago. And so this formal complaint was because they felt the Railroad Commission should have been plugging certain P13 wells in Pecos County. A P13 well is a well that was drilled as an oil and gas well and then conveyed by that oil and gas company to the landowner for use as a water well. The Railroad Commission back in the 50s and 60s did not call these P13 wells. The term P13 refers to the form that the Railroad Commission now uses to do that conveyance to make an oil and gas well a quote unquote water well. And so back when these wells were initially drilled, that form didn't even exist, but the Railroad Commission is still saying that because these wells are now reclassified as water wells, that the Railroad Commission has no authority to go back and plug them, even though the operator is gone and the landowner who initially signed the form is gone. The wells in question are causing a nuisance, they're causing groundwater pollution, and so Middle Pecos wants the Railroad Commission to plug them. In state law, an orphaned well under the Railroad Commission's jurisdiction is defined as a well that was originally permitted by the Railroad Commission. And it has no reference to whether that well was permitted as an oil and gas well or whether it's a water well. And so the only thing that really matters is that the Railroad Commission once permitted the well. But the commission is still holding firm that they have no authority over these wells. They shouldn't be using any of their money to go back and plug these wells that are now ostensibly orphaned because there's no operator around to go and fix them. So Middle Pecos filed that complaint. They've been going through this process with the Railroad Commission to get the Railroad Commission to respond to this. The Railroad Commission decided that Middle Pecos had no standing to file a formal complaint. And so that means that the case can no longer even proceed at the Railroad Commission. In the meantime, Middle Pecos went and filed a lawsuit in Travis County District Courts. Today, the final order from the commission basically simply exhausts all the regulatory remedies for this particular issue. And makes that lawsuit now a viable lawsuit. And so before you go into litigation or a lawsuit, you have to show that you've done everything you could at the regulatory level. And today, everything has been done that could be done for that particular issue with Middle Pecos. So now we'll just see what Travis County courts say, and we'll see what goes on with Middle Pecos.
And so with these P13 wells, is there like a number or an estimate for how many there are that are out there that are causing problems or just existing, right? As these sort of ambiguous, water wells that were drilled for oil and gas that might cause leaks and other kinds of things.
We have a database from the Railroad Commission. I don't recall exactly how far back it dates, but since they've been tracking P13 wells, there's at least 2,000 wells on the list. probably a lot of those wells are in good shape and aren't leaking. I can't say for sure, but there's probably some that are having problems. And there's probably a lot of other wells that we would now call P13 wells, but that never were actually registered using the form P13. And so there's probably like some of those legacy wells out there that would maybe ordinarily fall into that category.
Wow. And then, so once it goes to Travis County, how common is it for a groundwater district to file a suit like this? It seems kind of unprecedented in the time that I've looked at open meetings records. It seems,
That's a good question. Yeah, we haven't seen any other groundwater conservation districts file a suit against the Railroad Commission since we've been looking at this and since commissionship launched in 2021. But I don't know that if it's ever happened before. So it is an interesting question. Yeah.
Okay. So we'll be sort of waiting to see, I guess, what happens with the court case, right? Like what this sort of non-regulatory body decides, just a regular legal body, right? And then the question about the P13 wells, it's almost like, it seems like the paperwork is already decided, that the law, the evidence is on the side of, the Railroad Commission plugging. So, I know that there was like a moment when you were organizing a working group around P13 wells. Is this the kind of question that the working group would take up?
Yeah, and we actually are going to get started with that working group in the near future. We've got a meeting scheduled. And so the goal of the working group is to kind of figure out like what do people really want to see from the Railroad Commission when it comes to P13 wells. And so there's a question about whether landowners or mineral owners even think that P13 wells should be allowed to exist, right? Like, should this practice continue of conveying old oil and gas wells to landowners for use as water wells? And, surprisingly, even people who've been dealing with problem P13 wells have told us, well, no, we still want that opportunity to be able to use these as water wells. I think part of the problem comes down to, how these wells are handled. So what is supposed to happen is that the oil and gas operator plugs the well from the bottom hole to the base of usable quality water to protect the water strata. But the question is, if that operator is long gone, the company is bankrupt, and that plug fails, then who's responsible for handling it, right? And so are there other things that should be implemented in state policy to protect water resources and protect landowners when failures occur?
Yeah, I do feel bad for all the landowners that at some point, in the state history thought they were getting a water well for free and then come to find that it's this enormous giant problem that is sort of
it costs a lot of money to drill a water well. My water well on my ranch is about 500 feet deep, and I called around recently because my brothers are now going to drill water wells, and we were trying to get a ballpark estimate of how much it costs, and the quotes I was getting were like $30,000. I mean, it's expensive, but what we know in terms of dealing with a problem well that's causing pollution, Skylar White said that he spent $200,000 trying to clean up one of these P13 wells, and he didn't even finish. And so it can get really nasty out there with these P13 wells.
So the public input part of the meeting, I think, was really juicy this time around, and it touches on a ton of topics that I think are super important and are varied. There's a lot of different things that happen. So I thought maybe we could kind of go like speaker by speaker.
Yeah.
But this was we had a lot of participation, and that was, the organizing team at Commissionship did a lot of work to bring some folks and encourage those different community members to come in. And so I want to kind of talk to Marte here about, what went into that. Yeah, we're trying to fit in the screen.
Camera two. There we go. No.
What went into that effort and what we heard today, and sort of dive into some of the comments and what was the comments that people brought to the Railroad Commission.
Yeah, I mean, it was pretty wonderful delegation. First of all, thank you for everyone who's always supporting Commissionship and showing up and showing out as best as we can. And I always say, if you can show up, and you can show up however you can and whenever you can, it is impactful. And so the delegation that we brought this time was based out of San Antonio, trying to think.
Laredo.
Laredo, Austin
Austin.
folks, and then the staff at commission shift, right?
Mhm,
Am I missing anybody?
I think that's everyone.
El Paso.
Yeah, well, I'm good with that.
We
Yeah.
got, we got Sister Elizabeth, right?
Yeah, Sister Elizabeth's a little bit from everywhere,
Yeah.
but yeah, yeah, from San
Victoria.
Antonio. Oh, yeah, Victoria, so, yeah, and, everyone came with good intention and came from, you know, as we prepped them, Jose on our team, on organizing team, really was, intentional about having good conversation and really asking folks to come authentically with their voice, with their experience, and helping to destigmatize the sense of this expertise and not knowing enough about the industry, right? And that our lived experiences is an expertise. And so we had Maria Trevino from Laudato Si speaking for her first time and bringing her mother actually with her to share from her perspective, from someone from the Catholic faith, who is part of an initiative from the Pope to be directed to bring ideas and spaces of community together for faith and action, basically, and protecting our world and protecting our common community was really her message. And so that was powerful, I think, for her to come and speak about the importance of Hispanic communities being impacted and the lens of the worker, right? Like we are in a polarity of needing work and relying on the economy while also caring about their community, caring about their family and their community's public health and the public health of Texans across the state. So that was really powerful. I don't know if y'all want to talk about her or what you heard from her. We can continue on. with
Yeah.
other ones.
I have some notes from it, like there was a lot of things that she said that really stood out to me. She gave her comments in Spanish.
Oh, yes.
Which is still kind of new territory for the Railroad Commission to have people giving input in Spanish and to provide translation and interpretation live.
Yes.
So I think that's something kind of worth talking about, like
Yes.
how that went. And can you, I mean, what did you see, I guess, as on the ground with how that process worked?
Yeah, so we made reservation or registration for folks who needed an interpretation on Friday. And I inquired about what that interpretation was going to be like, and I was told we weren't sure. This is very new, baby steps. We're figuring it out as we go. And then I, reminded the person that I spoke with on registration about Title VI, because that is something we raise awareness about in our work and in our efforts, and the importance of,
Can you explain what Title VI is for folks who don't know?
Yes, Title VI is part of the civil rights policy. You might have to help me on the policy side.
I know, we need to say.
Yes, but basically it's a policy that was in 64.
Yeah, it's part of the Civil Rights Act, and so it guarantees language access basically to anyone, right?
Yeah, part of
Prevents
it.
Discrimination.
Yeah, so part of the equity and for the Civil Rights Act and the pieces around language access is what that covers and details. And so any governing body that receives federal funding is, from what I know from prior work around language access, is that they are required to create a feasible way for people to have public participation without any barriers, despite, their language preference or limitations. And so that's what Title VI is. And so we came in, thankfully our folks had their speeches in English and Spanish. The woman who came out was like a very recently hired Railroad Commission staff. And she was very kind and just was like, really, you could tell in her eyes, like nervous about interpreting, because this is not her field of expertise. She just happens to be bilingual, but there's a very important distinguishing factor between someone who's like me, who's bilingual and was raised by parents in a bilingual household, and someone who was trained as a formal licensed interpreter. And so that was something of observation and attention. And had we not prepared the documents in English and Spanish, she would have really it would have been a challenge for her to interpret. And what I observed is that literally she was reading off of our papers, and so are our people, but what about people who don't have the privilege of like preparation, right? Like these are people who are bilingual to some capacity, but English, like limited proficient, like LEP language, which is what said distinguished for us. But there are people who are solely like monolingual speakers for their native language, and that will be a challenge if we bring forth more people who won't, right, who won't have that LEP designation or a sense of like comfort with the language, so.
Yeah, it was kind of like an easy test run for the Railroad Commission to get their footing with providing language interpretation. But there will be times in the future when they need somebody who can legitimately think on their feet and like do the interpretation without a piece of paper in front of them. So that's what we want to see ultimately from the commission, is that they're making this stuff available, they're prepared to provide the resource when it's requested.
Yeah, and I think like follow-up, there's already a lot of things running in my head, but like at the end of the day, our goal is to make this agency, we're not trying to gotcha, we're trying to advance them in a place, to be at a place where we can say like, this is an agency that does right by people, no matter of their language limitations and access, and it is a right. Language is a right, language access is a right, and so we're not just like pulling this idea or concept out of thin air.
Yeah, and I think like, I want to talk a little about our experiences growing up on the border,
Yeah.
right, in multilingual community, like
Mhm.
down in Webb County and Laredo, like Laredo is a Spanish speaking city, like most people are not speaking to you initially in English, and like my Spanish is really bad, I'll be honest, but it is still very much a bilingual city and a
Mhm.
Spanish speaking city, and so is like the surrounding countryside. Like a lot of people, their preference is Spanish. If they get a document in English, it's not that easy for them. Like they can kind of work through it, but it's also like if you got a notice from the Railroad Commission about an injection well going in near your property, first of all, that's hard for an English speaker to
Yeah.
understand what that means. And then if you don't speak English or read English very well, then that's going to be a struggle.
Mhm.
Do you have any other reflections?
Jose mentioned that actually in his piece, who also was the
Yeah.
second speaker who spoke in Spanish, and that was also a significant point he was making, is like, yeah, like if there's an emergency and people need to be evacuated and there's no notifications that are coming to the household, it could be life or death.
That was such a good point. Yeah.
Mhm. So I think those were very powerful. I don't know if there's anything more. I mean, I think there's more to explore, but I think that was on the language piece. That
Yeah.
was a prominent piece.
And that was really the contents of what, you know, both Maria and Jose and Hedda, they all kind of were underscoring that need of just reaching out to communities in Texas genuinely, right?
Mhm.
And I really liked, I have it in the notes here, Maria's last thing was, we have a request, walk alongside these communities and truly listen to their concerns,
Mhm.
explore their needs before making decisions, open the linguistic door.
Mhm.
And the Railroad Commission is vital to the state of Texas, so we have to work together for every Texan.
Yeah.
So I think that that was just really powerful to hear told in different ways, but through these sort of new faces of the Railroad Commission giving public input, so.
Yeah, and I think that there was a push here of not just like of show me that you are going above and beyond to see how diverse and representative, truly get a representative input by Texans across the state, right? Also, Texas is like evolving and we have people coming from all over the world. Houston is one of the most diverse places I've ever been
Yeah.
across the state.
And it's not just English, Spanish, like Vietnamese is the third most spoken language in the state. And
Yeah.
there are a lot of languages spoken in Houston and even in Midland. I think somebody was telling me that Somali is another common language spoken in Midland.
Mm.
And so there's a lot of languages we're not used to hearing about.
Yeah, so, I mean, it has always been a place, right, of a binational experience, but I think like now there's a lot of like international experiences happening in our state. And we can't negate that, right? And we have to be inclusive and we have to bring in like how everybody was saying in the speaking roles today, like it is an asset to have diversity. It is an asset to have multiple languages, and we can't leave people behind because everyone has a value and contributes in a different way to this society and economically and just culturally. So we just have to be mindful of that. And
Yeah, I want to segue to what Sister Elizabeth was saying, because she had a really good point. She was talking about the waste pits in Nordheim and the way that that community had engaged in a permitting process for the waste pits in their community. And, you know, she remarked that, the communities that live there know the soil the best. They know how it behaves. They know that its quality and what it's like and what you have to do to get it to do what you
Yeah,
get it to
that's right.
do.
Yeah.
And I thought it was a really good example of why public participation and why community members' input is important, is because, you know, there are things that the engineers aren't thinking about because they're not used to this place, right? They're using like standardized models that everybody typically uses. You know, the Railroad Commission rules and design standards around these waste pit facilities are not particularly detailed or explicit. And so you're really relying on like subject matter experts, which in a community is the people who live there, who deal with the soil on a daily basis, who deal with the water on a daily
Exactly.
basis.
Mhm.
And so the story that she told was about a berm that was constructed for a waste pit. And because the soil is so finicky there, that berm just completely fell apart and there was wastewater and fluid falling out of that facility. She said it took a day and a half for it to flood all the way across a farmer's property and into a creek. And so that's the kind of thing we want to avoid. And we have to have public participation and community input to get better results in the future. And people who speak languages other than English have important information to contribute, and we need to recognize that and acknowledge it.
And going back to this thing about what we started with, right, is preparation of these like local community leaders and experts. These are experts. They need to step out of the traditional realm of what, and when I'm saying they, I'm talking about the Railroad Commission staff, right? And they need to see our people and our communities, like something that really stuck with me was something Sister Elizabeth said after lunch and was like, we're farmers, we're ranchers, we're rural people. Yeah, like there's this stigma and stereotype of rural people. But she's like, we're not dumb. We're not idiots. We know what we're talking about. We know because we've been connected and tied to this line. Same thing. And Hedda said, it's like, here's an invitation to work with us, right?
Yeah.
To work with us to find solutions. And that means you need to see our existence and our expertise as value added to decision-making tables, not after the fact, right?
Yeah.
Not treating our decisions after the fact. So,
Or making an assumption about what people are gonna say before they say it.
yes, exactly.
Right, or just valuing the data that gives you the answer that you want instead of the more complicated reality that, you know, having that different input will give you. It's not just, you know, we want this to go through, so we're gonna feed it, you know, the research, the information that will give us, you know, an outcome. So we mentioned briefly waste pits, and I
Yeah.
think maybe we should talk on a couple updates around dates coming up.
Yeah,
for the
sure.
meetings.
So the Railroad Commission is amending its statewide rules that govern waste pits. And so the rulemaking comment period deadline was extended to October 15th. So if you live next to one of these waste pits, it's really, really important that you write a comment on that. So this has to do with whether waste pits are required to have liners that protect the bottom of the pit from contaminating groundwater, whether the waste pits, whether you have to do groundwater monitoring around the waste pit, anything kind of related to groundwater protection and a waste pit facility, or kind of these new practices of solid waste recycling or fluid waste recycling. And so there's been a huge initiative to start recycling produced water, that's salt water that comes from an oil and gas well, to be able to reuse it. And so this rule governs those facilities and what happens to the contaminants at the end of the day after that recycling takes place. And so, you know, we heard some testimony not only from Sister Elizabeth, but also a man named Terry Allen from East Texas, who he talked about confirmed groundwater contamination from waste pits across the state, and the importance of addressing what are called reserve pits. So where oil and gas wells are drilled, the companies will often dig a pit on site and they'll include like drill cuttings, they'll include flowback fluids that come out of the well, maybe some initial produced water that comes out of the well, and some other kinds of fluid materials that can contain harmful chemicals and hydrocarbons and things in them. But this rule, one of the good things it does is that it will require authorization of those pits or registration of those pits. So we'll have more data at the commission on where those pits are located and the fact that they exist. But there's no requirements really on pit liners. you can have a pit that's within 100 feet of groundwater and no liner is required. There's no soil core sampling required. It could be nothing but sand from the bottom of the pit to the aquifer. And there's no requirements. And operators would be allowed to just dig these pits in after they're done and cover them up, and it's just like good to go, you know. And so that's stuff that for me as a landowner living in oil and gas country is really troubling, because there's a lot of the oil and gas development around me, and that's just a lot of little pockets of point source pollution into the aquifer. And so I think we do have to watch out for stuff like that. And you know, one of the other interesting things that we're seeing in that rulemaking is something that is not even required by the state legislature. Commissioner Wright has some waste recycling businesses and is trying to get the authority to use oil and gas solid waste as base for constructing roads or buildings. And so that's going to put a lot of harmful chemicals very close to people and potentially in a form that could contaminate waterways. And so if you live next to a county road in particular, or if you know any construction workers, please have them get in touch with us.
So yeah, that's a big piece, is the recycled materials could be potentially dangerous. And then the waste pit rules themselves, there's a lot of still gaps in the rulemaking. So do check out our website, because we have a lot of resources on our waste pits landing page in particular. So we'll be sharing out ways to sort of guidelines for if you want to make a public comment in time for that October 15th deadline. Definitely keep following us, because we're going to keep trying to prepare that participation and engagement. We also have some fun things planned for that deadline. It's October 15th, so we're getting into spooky season and Halloween, and it's also the day of the next open meeting here in Austin of the Railroad Commission. So we are going to have a gathering here in Austin outside the Railroad Commission building, and sort of make it a gathering. It's going to be focused around waste pits, but also about all these other issues that we want to see attention from the Railroad Commission on. So it'll be sort of a celebration of all the community that we're building so far, and also in support of, you know, strengthening our relationship with the Railroad Commission and them strengthening their relationship with us. So save the date, October 15th, and look out for details on joining us for this celebration. And it'll be a fun time and our last chance to get your comments in for that waste pits rulemaking. So, okay.
Because in the struggle, there will be joy.
Yeah.
And we are allowed to heal our inner child with Halloween or fall festivities.
And we have so many scary characters, like in the oil and gas scene. We have
Zombie
zombie wells. We have the waste pits, which we sometimes refer to as like Texas mystery sludge. We have ghost wells, right? The ones that are not in the coordinates, right? Aren't in the system.
The ones that are undocumented.
Undocumented wells, ghost wells, zombie wells. We have acid gas from carbon injection. So there's a lot of like scary characters that maybe we want to, you know, make a little bit more visible, bring some attention to.
Apathy. You can dress it as the apathy.
Apathy. I'd like to see someone
Zombies, not
eminent domain. I think that one can be kind of scary. Just take your land. So yeah, there's some chance to be creative, and maybe we'll have like a little costume
contest. Yes.
We'll be looking for some creative and spooky costumes. So yeah, that's going to be a fun time. And yeah, like I said, a chance to also submit your comments.
Yes.
And get plugged into some of the things that we have going on as the year goes on. So okay, we've talked about waste pits. We've talked about language accessibility at the Railroad Commission. I think we should talk about the comments that you gave. There's
everybody left.
Oh no, we lost a couple people.
Flaring
I hope we didn't lose our internet.
Moving to online, I think.
Okay.
Or offline, or
I think we're good. So Commission Shift published a report today, a long time in the making. This was, the report was called Permission Granted, and it's about flaring at the Railroad Commission of Texas and the way that they permit flaring at the Railroad Commission. This was authored by Andrew Wheat from Texans for Public Justice, and it was really a joint effort between Commission Shift, Texans for Public Justice, and Rio Grande International Study Center, also known as RISC, based down in Laredo, Texas. And so doing a lot of partner work with these three organizations and hoping to do some more outreach down in South Texas about flaring in the near future, as well as another, well, I won't announce it yet, but we have more to come on venting and flaring. But in this report, we wanted to see, you know, what is the Railroad Commission doing with respect to permitting and compliance for venting and flaring already? And how can we use modern tools to make this better, right? And to improve that approach. And so what we found was I guess it was even worse than I imagined it would be, unfortunately. And so we already know the railroad commissioners, like two of them have already cast doubt on human-caused climate change, and the other one has just derided federal methane regulations. And, you know, the commission is already suing the EPA for its methane rules, which would require an end to routine venting and flaring by, I think, 2030. And so that's concerning. But when it comes to their own rules at the Railroad Commission, it's clear that they're not designed to actually limit venting and flaring. And so I think a lot of people have heard the statistic that the Railroad Commission rarely rejects flaring permit applications. That was based on a 2018 analysis put together by the Wall Street Journal. They looked at 5 years of permitting data, and they found that the Railroad Commission hadn't rejected a single permit in those 5 years.
And we see that in the open meetings. It's, I mean,
every
open meeting.
approvals. And so, yeah, I think it was last year, Commissioner Wright all the commissioners approved one particular permitting situation, the flaring permit, even though the facility already had a pipeline nearby and just didn't want to pay the money to the pipeline company to take the gas away. And they still approved the flaring permit. And after that vote, Commissioner Wright gave a big speech about it, about how operators need to do better. And it was really perplexing to me. How could you make a big speech about this after you just said yes? Like you were the person in power who can say no. And so you know, rejecting permits is one thing. We have seen them reject a few permits in 2021 and 2022. That was part of our analysis. But out of those permits that were rejected, there were 32 permits rejected. 20 of them got their permits later on that year for the same location, doing the same thing, same volume. And they ended up getting 4 more permits at the same lease. And so it's not a meaningful rejection if the Railroad Commission turns around and gives it later on that year, and they end up giving more. And so the other thing we looked at were some of the basic metrics, like has the Railroad Commission changed the number of permits that it's doling out, the volumes that are allowed for those permits, and the durations of those permits. What we found is that from the 2010s, we looked at things decade by decade, from the 2010s to the 2020s, the average duration of a flaring permit is lower per permit. That's a good change. However, the volumes are slightly higher in those permits, and the number of permits issued have increased. The other thing that we noticed when we looked at this data that makes it really complicated for the Railroad Commission to do any kind of compliance or enforcement is that operators can get extensions and amendments to their flaring permits over and over again. And so it makes it really difficult to say, well, how much are you actually allowed to vent and flare? And like, can we compare that to how much you're saying you're venting and flaring? And there's no practical way for the commission to do that with all the operators who have flaring permits. So when we looked at the violation data for venting and flaring, like how many times has the Railroad Commission issued a violation to operators who are breaking the rules on venting and flaring? 2/3 of the violations issued have been for not submitting paperwork on time. None of the violations have been issued for operators who exceed their volume limits or their duration limits of their permits, because the commission has no way to check that. And so what we have is really a compliance system that was designed for pen and paper, but now here we are in the modern era where we have computers and we can do automatic analysis of all this stuff. but the system we have designed doesn't even make it easier, straightforward to do that. And so I think it's time to go back to the drawing board. It's time to design a venting and flaring compliance framework that makes sense for the modern era, for everything that we can do with data analysis and computers. And now all the satellite data we have to measure methane aerially and to measure nighttime flaring aerially. And so we really want to see, we want to see like high tech come to the world of mitigating these emissions and reducing waste at the Railroad Commission. And the reason why it's important is because it's affecting people's health on the ground in Texas. There are, I think, 7 of the 10 worst air pollution counties in the United States are in the Permian Basin, and they have the highest rates of child asthma. There's a reason for that. And there was this study in 2020 that found that women who live next to high rates of venting and flaring in the Eagleford Shale have 50% higher odds of preterm birth. And that's just unacceptable. And it's just wrong when you look at how the Railroad Commission has been enforcing its rules for venting and flaring, that there's not a better way for them to limit this activity.
Yeah, and I don't know if you covered this, but what is the Railroad Commission doing currently about the sort of the attempt to curb the rules by like the federal rule curbing? How are they responding?
So they challenged the EPA's methane rules, and so we're waiting to see what comes out of that. But I don't know if they'll be successful, if we'll have enough folks that are actually like supporting the methane rules to prevent that from happening. But if they are successful, then we get nothing here in Texas. But if we're successful, maybe we can get the Railroad Commission to eventually change their rules. But it has been over a decade that we've been trying to get the commission to do better on venting and flaring, and we're still not there. And so would be great if those federal rules actually came through.
So definitely check out the report on our website. We have distilled it into sort of an executive summary, so you can see some of the high level findings in the report and also some of the solutions that the report is suggesting. There's a lot of really good, just practical things. It's not just do better, it's do better in these really specific ways that are achievable, right?
Yes.
So there's really good
Have a
recommendations.
way of enforcing your own rules.
Right. I did see a question on our Facebook page. So I want to kind of share that here. Someone commented, they're talking about flaring and they say that's energy that's being converted to pollution and heat.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that with all the amazing engineers, they could figure out a better solution. Like, why can't you all use that extra methane instead of flaring it? What would you say to something like that?
Yeah, so there's been some interesting solutions proposed. One has been to station like mobile Bitcoin mines out by flares and use them there. But there are also ways to capture gas using mobile technologies. And I wrote a report when I used to work for Environmental Defense Fund. I wrote it back in 2017 with Colin Layden, and we looked at 4 different technologies and the break-even volumes of gas that would be needed to be produced from a site in order to make those technologies cost-effective. And I think what we found overall was that something like 80 to 90% of the sites in Texas could cost effectively use this technology. They were producing break-even volumes of gas that were just being vented and flared. And so, one of the things we heard one of the commissioners say a few months ago about the flaring rule and why they were challenging it was that it was going to make all these operators go bankrupt. It was going to put all these companies out of business, but it just doesn't track. When you look at the economics of these gas capture technologies, they are cost effective. They can be deployed to capture this gas. And another thing we found in this most recent analysis is that 50% or 50 companies statewide are venting and flaring 91% of the gas. So it's really a small portion of the industry that would even be affected by the EPA's methane rules or having to capture their gas. So we can do better. Yeah.
Thanks. All right, so thank you so much, both of you, for talking through all the different things that are happening. I feel like there's more on the calendar. Maybe we want to plug Community Connect and maybe share a little bit what that's about. We've got time.
Yeah. Tomorrow, we will be at 6 Central Time. We'll be hosting Community Connect, per our, schedule to keep that at once a month. And that one will be a continued conversation about what we're planning for October 15th. And talking through organizing tactics to reflect on and use, and also just to like process our comfort and discomforts with how we're doing the work that we're doing in our communities, right? Let's kick it back old school, continuing the organizing that we know works, the traditional one-to-one, leafleting, door knocking, house meetings. Let's talk about those organizing tactics and strategies. And then just like, yeah, how do we use those skills and those tactics in our local communities, to also mobilize and gear up for the fall. One of the activities will be the October 15th, Austin tailgate, I don't know, we haven't extravaganza, we haven't marked, we haven't created the branding spooky season. I think we were calling it like Fall Fright or.
Fall Fright, Waste Pits tailgate.
Yeah, Waste Pits and Zombie Wells, Spook Night or something, I don't know, or Spook Day, 'cause it's gonna be the daytime. Still figuring out the framing, but yeah, that'll be sort of like what we're gearing up for, and always moving the online to the offline, right? Because we wanna keep it accessible, we wanna keep people engaged and stay committed to our organizing tools and our organizing practices, because that's where our power lies, is in like our people power, right? We don't have the mega millions, but we do have connections and relations to webs and webs of networks of people. And so, yeah, that'll be what we'll be talking about tomorrow. It will not be so high level, like super technical in terms of our agenda, but we will create space for us to kind of talk through some of that, strategize, reflect, and just hear and generate ideas from our network, and create space to reflect together so that we can be stronger and support each other in the organizing that we do, online and offline.
Nice. Yeah, so join us for that. We'd love to see new faces there, and keep following us on our social channels. Our website is commissionship.org, and we'll be putting out more information about the waste pits rule, the flaring report, and lots of other things we have going on. So thank you guys.
Thanks,
Bye.
y'all.
Thank you.
Bye, Dad.